For the labeling and relabeling, there has two sub-regulation. First is duty of employer to ensure labeling. Second, relabeling. So for the duty, an employer should ensure that all chemicals hazardous to health supplied or purchased by him and used in the place of work are labelled, and that the labels are not removed, defaced, modified or altered. When the labels mentioned in sub-regulation above when the sub-regulation that mentioned are removed, defaced, modified or altered while the chemical hazardous to health is being used at place of work, the employer should relabel the chemical. For the relabeling, when a chemical hazardous to health is transferred into another container other than that in which it was originally supplied, and the contents of the container are not used within a normal work shift, the employer should ensure that the container is relabeled. If the contents of the container referred in sub-regulation that I mentioned are used within a normal work shift, the employer should ensure that the container is relabeled with the chemical name or the trade name as written on the original label. If the contents of the container referred to in sub-regulation at the first I mentioned the chemicals used in a testing chemical laboratory, the container should be relabeled in accordance with sub-regulation that I mentioned. The second regulation that I mentioned, whether or not the contents are used within a normal work shift. Notwithstanding sub-regulation in sub-regulation 1, 2 and 3, the container need not be relabeled if the chemical hazardous to health is used immediately. The purpose of labeling and relabeling means labeling or relabeling in the case of a chemical hazardous to health in accordance with the requirements of the Occupational Safety and Health classification, packaging and labeling of hazardous chemicals under regulations 1997. In the case of a pesticide, in accordance with the requirements of the Pesticide Act 1974, and the last, in the case of schedule waste, in accordance with the requirements of the Environmental Quality Schedule Waste under regulations 1989. For the health surveillance, if the assessment indicates that health surveillance is required to protect the health of employees who are exposed or may be exposed to chemicals hazardous to health, the employer should conduct a health surveillance program, and the medical surveillance component of the health surveillance program should be carried out by an occupational health doctor. If an employee is exposed or may be exposed to chemical hazardous to health listed in Schedule 2, the health surveillance required under sub-regulation of the assessment indicates that health surveillance is required must include medical surveillance conducted at intervals of not more than 12 months or shorter interval as determined by the occupational health doctor or an occupational safety and health officer who is also a medical practitioner. The employer must ensure that health surveillance records or copies thereof are kept properly and in order, and also kept for 30 years from the date it was last made. Then the employer needs to provide all required records as requested to be kept through sub-regulation that mention if an employee is exposed or may be exposed to chemical hazardous to health listed in Schedule 2 to the Director General for assessment and inspection. Other than that, upon due notice, the employer should allow any of its employee to access health surveillance records that related to employee in case if anything happened. For the monitoring of exposure at the place of work, where a health risk assessment indicates that exposure monitoring is required or it is necessary to ensure the maintenance of adequate control over employee exposure to health hazardous chemicals. Employers should ensure that employee exposure to health hazardous chemicals is monitored in accordance with approved method, monitoring and analysis methods. If the employee is exposed or may be exposed to chemicals hazardous to health listed in Schedule 2. Schedule 2 also you can see in the record keeping. The monitoring of employees' exposures specified in the above sub-regulation should be repeated at intervals not exceeding 6 months or at shorter intervals as determined by the assessor, and exposure monitoring must continue at this frequency until at that time the assessor is satisfied that further exposure monitoring is no longer required. While exposure monitoring needs to be performed by a hygiene technician unless monitoring is limited to checking for the presence of toxic or flammable gases and oxygen levels in the confined space prior to entry. In addition, the employer must maintain in an orderly manner and compile any notes or summary records from each monitoring performed by the purpose of this regulation and should remain available when the record represents the personal exposure of a person exposed to any chemical hazardous to health for at least 30 years and in any other case for at least 5 years.
Assalamualaikum and salam sejahtera to se-alias. My name is Dayana binti Abdul Razak. I am from DEK section 1.1. My matrix number is D0120100147. I will continue for provision on regulation of occupational safety and health, use and standard of exposure of chemical hazard to health, regulations 2000. So I will explain for the last 4 parts, which is part 7, information, instruction and training. At the first point, we can see an employer who undertakes work can expose or likely to expose his employees to chemical hazard. The employers must provide employees with such information, instruction, training to be necessary for the workers to enable the rule. The second point, the employer must provide all of the information such as result of monitoring of exposure at the place work. From that, the effective communication has played a vital part in engaging with employees. The third point, for this part of the information, a person instruction and supervision should also be primary concern for their provision. The last point, the chemical safety data is important to employers also, because the chemical safety data which not has been prepared must obtain the relevant information from the supplier and cannot use the chemical until the further information is obtained. Next, part 10, which is medical removal protection. The first point, the employer will not allow employee to work and remove him or her from employment that expose and likely to expose him or her to chemical hazard to health each time the medical discovery is made. The second point, the employer will allow his employee to return to work when the next medical determination indicates a good condition or the result indicates that the employer no longer has a detected risk such as pregnant and breastfeeding. The third point, practitioner means a medical practitioner that is registered under the Medical Act 1971, which is in Act 50. So, Medical Act 71 is an act to consolidate and amend the law relating to the registration and practice of medical practitioner and for the national purpose to provide for a certain provision. So the third part is part 11, which is warning sign. The first one, the warning sign are installed in clear places at each entrance area to warn people entering the hazard area. So when the chemical hazard used in any area, it will affect the human health. The second point, the employer also needs to ensure other relevant information provided to persons who may or may not be at risk of exposure to chemical hazard to health. The third point, the employer should also ensure that the warning signs required by this regulation when it is illuminated and clean as needed so that the legend is easily visible. The next point is it is must also be written in national language and English and can be printed in dark with a white background. So from that we can see the effectiveness of warning sign and it cannot be affected by the poor design, insufficient number and the improper sign function. So for the last part of provision on regulation is part 12, the record keeping. So the first point, the retention of records by employers should be emphasized in the workplace. The employer needs to send the records required to be kept under the regulation of assessment report, record of engineering control equipment, information, instruction and training, monitoring to exposure, and health surveillance program to Director General. So the employer must give the Director General at least 3 months notice in writing that he may intends to dispose of the records and the records needs to be kept with the Director General if he requested to do so within that period. That's all from me and thank you.